Welcome to another episode of Exercise Matters with me, Randall Cooper.
And me, Mick Hughes.
Support for today's episode comes from Premax Performance Skincare. If you're active, you focus on strength, endurance and recovery. But what about your skin? Sweat, friction and the elements take a toll. That's where Premax comes in. High-performance skincare made for high-performance people. From recovery creams to anti-chafe balms, massage creams to exercise-specific barrier creams, we help your skin go the distance. Keep your skin as fit as your body with Premax. Available now at premax.co.
Support for today's episode also comes from Learn.Physio. Health professionals, are you staying ahead of the game? Learn.Physio brings you cutting-edge education from world-class experts in sports and musculoskeletal medicine, online courses, hands-on practicals and expert resources, all backed by the latest evidence and designed to fit into your busy schedule. To be your best, learn from the best. Get started today at Learn.Physio.
Well, good morning, Mick. How are you this week?
Good
Have you got any
morning,
update? You got any updates for us? I know people are waiting with bated breath now about what you're doing for exercise.
Always got a life update. Do 4x4, another cracking session today. I know I was just blowing my own trumpet last week saying that I was going to extend it out to 5x4s and rebrand it and rename it to be the Hughes.
It's very arrogant.
5x4 protocol. Yeah, it was really rude. Great disrespect to Jan and his colleagues in Norway. No, I'm just cruising along, mate. I'm actually still loving it, still enjoying it. I did have a deload last week. Carly was away, so I had to just sort of rein in the early morning sessions. Can't leave the kids at home unattended. It's 5 a.m. in the morning, so I only had one session last week, but it was good. I think that's what I needed. I'd stacked up about 4 or 5 weeks in a row with the full program plus on my weight, so I was definitely feeling a little bit tired last week. And first session back today was great. I had good energy levels, and I think it's just going well, and I like how that was kind of almost like a self-imposed deload week, because I often say to my patients, look, every 4 weeks or so, 4 to 6 weeks, you either get sick or sore, so just make sure you have these little deload periods planned throughout your training cycle and try and get ahead of that sickness or soreness.
It's a timely comment you make, because these next two episodes we're going to talk about Zone 2 training. It's such a big buzz thing. But as we'll kind of get through the content over the next two episodes, one of the things that really struck me when I was kind of doing the background research about this is actually how much time you need to spend in Zone 2 for it to be effective. And I'll leave that as a hook for people to keep listening in here. But the thing is, but the thing is that you've got to make sure that you're fitting in exercise into your life, because life gets busy and you can't always, I'll kind of give the game away a little bit, because like when you listen to the experts on this stuff, it's, if you're doing Zone 2 training, like you really should be doing 3 or 4 hours of it.
Yeah, it's long.
Each week, to really get the maximum benefits out of it. And then if you're going to integrate in some high intensity aerobic work, and then you're going to do 2 or 3 weight sessions a week, you can easily kind of spend 8 to 10 hours a week exercising. And for guys like you and me, like that's challenging, with work and family. It's trying to squeeze that in is great in principle. And if you ride the Tour de France, then fine. But if you're just an everyday blow Joe like us two, finding that time is a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, you got to pick your battles. That's what I'd say to each and every patient, whether or not it's ACL rehab or it's just general health and wellness that they're looking to and just make themselves a little bit fitter for life. It's just trying to pick your battles and kind of plug exercise into your week rather than the other way around. Always talk about, never sort of try to shove a square peg into a round hole or vice versa. We got to make exercise achievable and doable and sustainable. And if 4 or 5 hours of training is unrealistic for you, then we've got to find other ways to sort of keep things ticking over. So, I'm all for being flexible and adaptable. And I really don't like the people that sort of say you got 24 hours a day to exercise, because my 24 hours a day looks very different to your 24 hours a day, particularly if we're comparing younger, singletons with no kids versus, blokes with multiple kids like you and I.
Yeah, and I think that I reflect back on, my rehab work and prescribing exercise. I remember one of the most common questions I'd ask my patients would be, tell me how much time you've got a week realistically that you can devote to this, and I'll structure a program around that. rather than the other way, saying, here's a program and I'm expecting you to do 8 to 10 hours a week, and they look at it and go, oh, I'll try, buddy, but like I've got no chance of squeezing that in. You really need to kind of use the time you've got to maximum efficiency. Yep. So we've got a double header, and this is on a big, I wouldn't say controversial topic. There is some controversy in here, but it's something that I think is the buzzword at the moment. You jump on any podcast and to do with exercise, they're talking about zone 2 at the moment. Social media is going crazy. As we've found in so many aspects of health and fitness, like people get very polarized, and like you've definitely got people in the zone 2 camp who go, zone 2 is it. You don't need to do anything else other than zone 2. And then there's other people who go, well, maybe it's not as important as what people used to think it is. It is trendy, and that's why I want to kind of cut down and have a scientific lens on this topic over 2 episodes. But before we get into like some of the background exercise physiology and stuff, mate, we spoke about this just a little bit before we just popped on air, but what does zone 2 mean to you? You've done exercise phys, a while ago now.
Yeah,
and
a long time ago.
And when people say, I want to do some zone 2 training, like what instantly pops into your head?
Yeah, well, one, I was very confused by what zone 2 was. So I drifted away when I studied exercise science. Zone 2 and the definition of zone 2 wasn't really a thing. It was kind of aerobic or anaerobic. Yeah, we had fartlek training, we had interval training, we had some other kind of definitions to describe exercise in varying intensities, but zone 2 wasn't a thing. And it's only been probably in the last 5 years where it's become very popular through social media and some, pretty big names that are, sprouting its claims. To me, without kind of knowing the finer details of it, zone 2 training to me was always a moderate intensity exercise, something that sits probably around the 70 to 80% mark, which I know is not completely accurate, but that in my head is kind of what it was. And traditionally, like training intensities were broken down to levels 1, 2, and 3, or zones 1, 2, 3. So I know it's a lot more nuanced than that, but to me, that's how it sits. And I could imagine there's a lot of people out there who aren't as invested in their health as what some other people, be it younger in their 20s or 30s versus, up in their 40s or 50s who are completing lots of marathons and tries and training. There'd be a lot of average sort of mums and dads like you and I or me, and who kind of zone 2 just doesn't really mean a thing, so to speak. And to them, aerobic or anaerobic sort of exercise probably sits with them a little bit easier than the zones 1 through to 5 or zones 1 through to 6, depending on what you're reading. So I can't wait to hear more about it. And I hear you got a pretty big name in the scientific world coming on board to sort of help us digest this.
I do. And I think your reflection is what I think that most people reflect on it as well, is there's confusion around it. There's confusion exactly what zone 2 means. And the anchor of this podcast over the next 2 episodes is around a scientific paper that was published this year in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. And the title of it is, What is Zone 2 Training? Experts' Viewpoint on Definition, Training Methods and Expected Adaptations. And its lead author is a Spanish fellow by the name of Dr. Sebastian Sitko. And Sebastian, I've spoken to Sebastian before this episode, so I've got a bunch of comments and clips from him that we're going to go through. But I've used this as essentially kind of the thread through both of these episodes. The first episode, we're going to talk about what is aerobic threshold, what is lactate, and what is zone 2 and engine building, and we'll get some definitions around that. And then the second episode, which will be next week, we're going to talk about how people should integrate zone 2 with high intensity training. So the Mick Hughes 5x4, what do you call it now, mate? It's the
Mick
I think
Hughes
we'll just let's just we'll keep calling it the Norwegian 4x4. Okay, so I don't think it's going to catch on as much as you want it to.
No.
So that's these 2 episodes, and I think it's really beneficial. I must say that in doing the prep for this, I've learnt a lot. And being a physiotherapist, I was actually a bit nervous about kind of tackling this topic because I feel like it is very much an exercise physiologist's domain. But in some ways, I think that, and I'm not the expert, but I have looked into it, I've got an interest in it, and I've got the expert on. So hopefully people get a lot away, take a lot away from...
Well, it's nothing better than going straight to the horse's mouth to find out all this information. And what a great way to break down this paper by asking the lead author to come along and share their insight, because it's often not something that can easily be done. So well done for getting a hold of Sebastian and talking shop.
All right, well, let's get into it. There's just a couple of things that I want to kind of define to start with, so it frames up what we're going to talk about, and that is what you referred to, and that's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic systems. So aerobic metabolism uses oxygen, mainly in the form of fat and carbohydrates, to support long efforts. So aerobic stuff is like your long bike rides, your marathon running, anything that's going to last, let's say, 15, 20 minutes or longer. Anaerobic metabolism relies on glycolysis, okay, without full oxidation. So essentially you're not using oxygen, and that's the term anaerobic, and it drives harder efforts, but you accumulate fatigue really quickly. So think of sprints, 400-meter runs, 3 minutes on a rower as hard as you can go. They are anaerobic activities, but there's also a crossover, and we'll talk about this, and we'll talk about kind of like different zones and lactates and what they mean just in a minute. But there is a lot of people think that aerobic is and anaerobic is like a switch. So you go from an aerobic model where you're kind of going along for a light jog, for instance, and then you start to run a bit faster, and then boom, you kind of become anaerobic all in one go. It's not like that. It's essentially like there's a crossover, aerobic and anaerobic mechanisms during exercise. So we'll talk through that. So there are zones, and for those who have got like wearable Garmin's and that kind of thing, they'll definitely kind of resonate with what we're talking about. And for the serious exercises, they'll know what we're talking about as well. And I'll talk through, and we're going to use the 5/6 zone model mainly to kind of frame up this conversation today. But there is also a 3-zone model. So the 3-zone model is basically easy, moderate, hard intensity. There is a 7-zone model, which is generally used by cyclists, and that relates a little bit more to power. I won't go into too much detail because I want to kind of try and keep the theory of it fairly simple. The main model I want is this 5-zone model, and let's just talk through what each zone means. So zone 1 is your super easy recovery zone. It's very light. It's about 50 to 60% of your heart rate max. When you're in this zone, you should be able to hold a full conversation. Really, this zone is mainly kind of used to promote blood flow and recovery, and you use it a bit as you warm up and you cool down. Zone 2 is where you start to step it up a little bit more. And if you're using like an analogy of someone just kind of running on a treadmill and it slowly just gets faster and faster, this is where you kind of go up and you start to increase your heart rate up to about 60 to 70% of your heart rate max. You can still speak in full sentences, and we'll talk about the talk test as we go through this, but you're really starting to notice that you're exercising an effort. This is what we're going to talk about today, this zone 2 stuff. You start to build endurance, you bring in your mitochondrial function. It's very much referred to as the fat max or the fat burning zone, so we'll kind of talk through that as well today. So that zone 2. Then as you start running faster, up to about 70 to 80% of your heart rate max, this is what's called a tempo zone or zone 3. And this is where you can only speak in short phrases, and breathing is really quite heavy. Like you can kind of get a few words out, but you definitely cannot have full conversations. The primary goal of this phase is increased speed and aerobic capacity. Then as you continually get faster, you start to go into zone 4. This is about 80 to 90% of your heart rate max. This is what's referred to as the threshold zone. Very laboured breathing, can get a few words out. And this is where you're really starting to kind of push what we'll call this lactate threshold. So it's basically this is the zone that if you're going to go as hard as you can for an hour, whether it's a run, bike ride, swim or whatever, this is it. Like this is your race pace, and this is as hard as you can go. And after about an hour or 75 minutes ago, you've got nothing left to give. Zone 5 is your VO2 max zone. Very hard, 90 to 100% of your heart rate max. You're gasping for breath. Speaking is basically impossible. This is what you're doing with your 4x4, Mick, when you're kind of cranking out. Yep, but that last one. And then the zone 6 is essentially is not used all that often, but I think last week Andrew Russell spoke about it when he was talking about his middle distance runner and long distance runner, sorry. And that's where it's just an all-out effort where you just can't go any harder. I always think of that as like a 200-meter sprint or, a 400-meter lap on the velodrome, as hard as you can possibly go.
Yeah.
So that how do those zones sit with you?
Yeah, great. I guess my only question is, and something whether or not it came up in your conversation, but the 50 to 60%, the 67% heart rate maxes, are they based on the old method that I grew up on in exercise science school of 220 minus your age? Is that something that's still for people to try and figure out? Is that the kind of calculation or the formula used to find out those zones, or are we now leaning towards more of a rate of perceived exertion scale? What did you find there in your research?
Yeah, really good question. And there are different models to do it. So yes, there is a very simplistic model to basically 220 minus your age, that's your maximum heart rate, and use those heart rate zones as one method. The more sophisticated method will be for the cyclists and the runners to do what's called a threshold test. So they will basically do 20 minutes an all-out effort, and that's what they consider the top of their zone for. And then everything is a derivative of that, and that's where they kind of place their training zones. And then there is and this is where most of what we'll discuss kind of today is just the perceived exertion and also the ventilatory kind of response to exercise as well, where you can essentially kind of be pretty close to where you need to be by how hard you're breathing, essentially.
Okay. Yep.
So that's kind of and Sebastian will kind of clear this up as we kind of get his comments integrated as well. But it is slightly confusing, and that's why I just wanted to say, for us, in these next two episodes, we'll talk about those 5 zones.
Yeah, awesome. And obviously focus on the zone 2 section. And that's definitely zone 2 by this table and calculations, probably a little bit lower than what I'd previously kind of understood or had assumed what zone 2 training was. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Can't wait to sort of hear a little bit more about it, because at the moment it seems to be zone 2, from the Peter Attia perspective, some of the stuff that I've read and heard about his comments on zone 2 is a little bit more towards longevity. Would that be right in saying that, or is there obviously benefits outside of just this longevity perception?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think that you need to separate performance from health. So we generally will talk about zone 2 training to help maximize athletic performance and improving mitochondrial health and function, and how that's going to relate to improving your aerobic capacity, basically. There's a whole different conversation about zone 2 training and its effect on your metabolic health, chronic disease, longevity, that kind of stuff. So that's definitely something that we can and should tackle maybe down the track. But I wanted to kind of more have, seeming this is about exercise, a lot of people who listen to this are thinking about maximizing the most out of their exercise, not living as long as they can. The two go hand in hand, but Yep. So at this point, I'll bring in Sebastian Sitko. So as I said before, he's the lead author of What is Zone 2 Training. He's got a PhD in sports science. He's got a master's degree in high performance sports by the French Olympic Committee. He's got a master's degree in training and performance evaluation. He's got a master's degree in sports nutrition, and he's got a bachelor's degree in sports science and honorary distinction. So he's extremely qualified, not only with his training, but he's also been and is a national cycling, triathlon and athletics coach, and he's coached over 200 professional and amateur athletes. And I really enjoyed talking to him because he's Spanish. The English stuff, he's very good with his English, but you'll notice the accent. But he's that beautiful blend that you and I really resonate with, a clinician, practitioner and researcher at the same time. Yeah. So real world take home messages, I think are very cool. And you'll hear those kind of come through today.
Very good.
All right. So the first question I asked Sebastian was, why did Zone 2 need to be clarified? And this is his response.
Well, first, I would like to say that I think that sports science in general, and especially the divulgation around sports science, tends to follow trends. And, as a result, there are certain concepts, like in this case, Zone 2 training, that are often become repeated mantras, and there's no much critical assessment of the science behind them, no? So I think that normally there's a little bit of a gap between what's practiced in the field and what is recommended in the papers, or what is currently researched in the scientific community. And just to address this, we tried to reach a consensus. I reached out to several very respected colleagues, generally speaking in the cycling world, because our paper is generally quite specific about cycling, but most of the recommendations, you can apply them also to other sports. And, we try to provide clearer guidelines because, as you say, there are many different interpretations of what zone 2 training could be. And I think that most of these different interpretations come because people who are trying to train in zone 2 are coming from different sports. And, if you try to set zone 2 while running and while cycling, you will have different muscle pattern recruitment, different muscle groups, different amount of muscle recruited during the sport. You will reach a different maximal heart rate, etc. No? So you are basically trying to unify something across different sports, which are quite different, even while we are talking, of course, about endurance sports. So I think most of the misunderstanding comes from this variety of sports and practitioners.
Yeah, it's a good point that there is so much different language and words used, even between like running and cycling and swimming, for instance, which are the big three aerobic sports, about what they will term as threshold versus functional threshold power and that kind of thing. So I think his lens to kind of say, let's make sure that we're all talking about the same thing was an important thing. And for him to draw 14 kind of experts around the world, I thought was a really good thing to do.
Yeah, well done. Like anything, these consensus are super important to get everyone on the same page because there's a lot of confusion out there. So yeah, it's very important.
So the next thing I asked Sebastian is what should zone 2 feel like for those who don't have lactate blood tests done on a regular basis and they don't have a wearable, for instance? How do people know that they're actually in this right zone?
I think that in general, it will feel quite easy. We are talking way below 4 or 5 in a scale of 10 in the rate of perceived exertion. Of course, you must be able to talk quite easily while performing the exercise. So in general, your feeling must be, this is very, very easy, which, after 3 or 4 or 6 hours of exercise at this same intensity may not feel as easy as at the beginning, but that's another story.
Easy. So not moderate. I know that when you, like at the start, that was the word that you used, and I paid attention to the word that you used, but like easy is the word that Sebastian used. And that actually surprised me is that I thought it would have been just a little bit harder than easy to make it very simplistic.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know. Easy to me just seems like it's not providing any benefit whatsoever. Like it just, it kind of, it's not a waste of time. Like I always think about, okay, I've got an hour, to exercise. So I want to kind of get the bang for buck. I want to get this feeling of exercise. I don't need to be also too wiping myself out, but I kind of don't necessarily want to feel like it's too easy as well. So yeah, that's an interesting piece of commentary there to probably make myself feel a bit better that I'm actually not wasting my time by going for that easy walk or that easy cycle or that easy run.
Yeah. There's just a concept and some terminology that I just want to bring in now, and that is what in the sports science world is referred to as lactate thresholds and ventilatory thresholds. So there's a lactate threshold 1 and a lactate threshold 2, and there's a ventilatory threshold 1 and a ventilatory threshold 2. And basically, we will have lactate in our system all the time. Basically, lactate is being produced anytime there's glycolysis. So there are both aerobic and anaerobic kind of processes going on in our body at any one time. But using that example of the person on the treadmill, once you start to get to the end of zone 2 and into zone 3, what we'll see is that the anaerobic system starts to kick in more and starts to use the body starts to use it more and more. And below the top of zone 2 and down, your body will just clear lactate at a constant rate. So you'll have a base level of lactate the whole way. But as you start to kind of run faster and faster, your body basically can't keep up with the lactate that's being produced. So you will start to see lactate rise. And that's the definition at the moment of, and this is what Sebastian will say in a minute, is that at that point of inflection, that's where is the top of zone 2. And that's really where we want to be. As you continue to run faster and faster, your lactate keeps going up, and you'll get to a point where at the top of zone 4, where lactate becomes, it just goes up exponentially, and that's your lactate threshold 2. So the ventilatory thresholds are pretty much exactly the same thing, because as your lactate increases, your muscles are becoming more acidic. So you need to blow off more CO2 to stabilize that muscle acidity. So LT1, lactate threshold 1, pretty much means the same as ventilatory threshold 1. And LT2 pretty much means the same as LT2. How's that explanation from a physio to an exercise physiologist, mate? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah. That sounds very reasonable. It just got me thinking about, the pre-workout stuff we talked about, a few episodes ago, with beta-alanine being this, supplement that's often involved in pre-workouts that sort of, I guess, help buffer some of the lactate that's in our system. It's now questioning, is obviously it's a pre-workout, it's designed to sort of help things. Would that interact here in a positive or negative way? Like obviously if it's help cleaning out the pH and clean up, I guess, the lactate, does it allow us to exercise higher for longer? Is that kind of, I'm just thinking out loud now because now it's got me thinking about something I've spoke about a few episodes ago in a real life context.
For sure. But for zone 2, no, because again, your lactate should be kind of like just at the baseline, just before it starts to kind of inflect up. Zone 4 is then, we should actually have a session on this one day, but zone 4 is where you're actually right at the end of that kind of gradual increase in lactate before it goes exponential. And that's where like you really will start to kind of see these threshold sessions, your race pace kind of work done. And that's where the beta-alanine will kind of kick into gear and allow you just to go that extra 5 or 10% or 13% from the, from your stats that you presented. Harder at that point.
Yep. All right. That makes sense now that we're talking about it in a real life context.
So the kind of the sweet spot, and this is where particularly kind of people on social media get very, very particular about it, is that the best place to be in zone 2 and to get the most out of zone 2 training is to be right at the top of that zone 2 spectrum. So just before lactate really starts to kind of kick up. So I asked Sebastian about that. How do you know, again, with very simple tests, that you're in that zone?
Well, in general, training adaptations work as a continuum. So, even while we try to differentiate in different zones, the fact is that we don't really know whether being above zone 2 or just below will change much of your panorama, no? Or the adaptations you will get after the training. So in general, I would say try to stay below this first metabolic turn point, but you don't have to be like super strict about it.
As I said right at the start, he was not as particular as others about kind of like the real world application. People will talk about the talk test. So if you can talk in full sentences, I think the perceived exertion rating is about a 3 or 4 out of 10 as far as intensity goes. His point is that if you're round about there, and that's a roundabout where you feel, the benefits, I'm going to talk about some of the physiological adaptations next, but the benefits, doesn't matter if you tip a little bit into zone 3, doesn't matter if you're kind of a little bit kind of down and kind of in the mid part or low zone 2, you're still probably going to get the benefits that you're looking for by training in that zone.
Yeah, nice. Oh, that would be reassuring for a lot of people who are probably watching their heart rates or to a very particular number. But yeah, I like that real world application. I love the concept of the talk tests as well. I think that's something I'm very familiar with from exercise science days. That test has been around for decades and decades. So it's a really nice thing to anchor people's perception of intensity of exercise.
So Sebastian's paper does go through, and his consensus, I should say, like and the group together came up with what they considered that the key physiological adaptations from doing zone 2 exercise. So this is why you want to do this type of training. The first is they agreed that there are broad central and peripheral adaptations, especially in muscles, when you're training in that zone. So some of these include increased muscle capillarization. So basically you start to grow new neo blood vessels into your muscles and your soft tissues to better support oxygen delivery. So that's a mechanical physical change. It increases mitochondrial enzymes, particularly in type 1 fibers. And this is for those who have done biology in the past, mitochondria is super important to cells. It's the powerhouse. It's basically the organ within cells that converts food or into energy. The better your mitochondria are, the better your function as an athlete and a person. So that's definitely one thing that Zone 2 will help with. And you'll also see an improvement in metabolic efficiency. So it's including a better lactate clearance at a given power output, as the cyclist would call it, or a better pace for what you'll do. And to give you an example, it's quite public, but Tadej Pogacar, he's won the last couple of Tour de France's, power. He's definitely got some power because I'm thinking about it right now. But he does about 80% of his, or up to 90% of his training in Zone 2. And when you're on the watt bike, when you're on the bike, mate, do you get an output of watts? Do you know how many watts you kind of will normally push out? So tell me about that. What's normal for you?
I actually haven't been keeping an eye on that. I've just been keeping an eye on my split times. So when I crank up the watt bike up to 10 out of 10 intensity, so that it's a fan bike. When I'm working for 4 minutes, I crank it up to 10, and I'll try and keep a 1 minute 50 per 500. No, what's the 1 minute 50 per 500 meter pace. But when I'm just cruising, it'll drift out to a 6 minute kind of thing. So that's my rest and recovery period of time. But I'll keep an eye on it, and I'll report back next time.
All right. So for me, like when I'm kind of exercising in the spinning sessions and stuff, like my all-out efforts are probably around about 400 watts. My Zone 5, I would say, is between 300 and 350 watts. And then easy for me, Zone 2 would probably be somewhere in the vicinity of 150 to 200 watts. Tadej Pogacar, when he trains at the top of his Zone 2, is pumping out between 320 and 340 watts.
Wow.
For 4 or 5 hours.
Jeez.
So his Zone 2 is the same as my Zone 5, but he's the world's best, right? And then I could use the same examples for Kipchoge when he runs his marathon under 2 hours, and the distance swimmers, the ridiculous. So your Zone 2 is different to my Zone 2, is different to everyone else's Zone 2. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of distinguish. But at the same time, training Zone 2 improves Zone 2. So if you are kind of traveling along on a bike, for instance, and I'm my 150 to 200 watts and I continue to bike ride and do a lot of Zone 2 training on the bike, I'll probably get up to 250 or 200, maybe at the max, maybe 220 to 250 or something if I do it well. And you see that all the time. So as we've found and talked about so much in this podcast, if you train something specifically, that specificity will improve. If you want a better aerobic engine and you want to just kind of chug along at a Zone 2 at a faster pace, train it and it will improve.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight, because for me, I don't know, like I've always had this perception that if you want to break through some kind of little fitness sort of plateaus, we just got to hit it with some high intensity exercise and go above what your body's capable of doing for a brief period of time. But this kind of concept of, if you want to get your Zone 2 better, start, obviously then channeling into that. I think the biggest barrier to people trying to get Zone 2 better is purely time. Sounds like that's going to be a pretty big limiting factor there, is the length of time it takes for you to get substantial gains there.
Yeah. So there's a few other physiological adaptations that are beneficial. You do get better metabolic efficiency over time. So as we were speaking about, you do get better at clearing out lactate. You do actually get a modest increase in VO2 max and critical power. So even if you don't do any high intensity stuff, your VO2 does improve a bit, not as much as if you're going to train HIIT, and let's talk about that next week a bit more. The other interesting thing that they discuss in the paper is experts highlighted that it improves cognitive resilience, because a lot of Zone 2 training is as boring as heck. And particularly for the cyclists that they're doing it for 3, 4, even up to 5 hours sometimes, like that builds mental fortitude. And I think it's a really important kind of thing, particularly if you're a cyclist and you do want to race in like a 6 or 7 hour race. You got to know that you can do it. And unless you, it's an interesting thing, because I thought they were only going to talk about, blood lactates and that kind of thing. So
it's a nice side effect. We should get more of the teenagers who are really struggling. I might get my kids who are struggling for attention spans to get out there and just do a bit more longer, slower Zone 2 training with me. But I get that myself. Like I probably struggle for exercising, probably virtue of just our busy kind of time. But I sort of struggle, sitting on a bike for an hour. It's like, I'm bored. But that you just got to grind it out. If that's your competition, you just got to grind it out and do it. So yeah, it makes sense. It improves your cognitive resilience.
I did ask Sebastian about the monotony of zone 2, because again, a lot of the proponents, the people who advocate for it in its purity, will say you just got to sit on a certain heart rate or a certain wattage or whatever and just sit there for 4 hours. And I said, do you really need to do that? Like, is it good? So here's what Sebastian had to say.
Well, we know quite well that in endurance sports in general and cycling in particular, you need monotony in your training, okay? Because you are basically repeating all the same type of efforts during years, waiting to adaptations to occur, no? So of course you need some monotony, but the fact is that all athletes will get bored earlier or later, but they will get bored. So you have to incorporate some kind of variations in the training, especially in this kind of sessions, because normally, especially in cycling, you will work with quite long sessions. We are talking always longer than 2 hours, normally 4 to 6 hour sessions of easy riding, and this can become quite boring. So we'll have to add a little bit of variation. Maybe it may be a little bit of zone 3 here or there, or may also be just using zone 2 during rest periods between harder intervals. This is what we normally do. For example, you may have a threshold session, but in between the efforts, you have a 2-hour ride in zone 2. So that will be this kind of implementation.
And thank him for that. I mean, I'm glad if I wanted to do cycling a long distance, I'd get him as my coach, because I know even from my swimming experience, like if I didn't have my squad around me, and B, like all the different kind of tricks and sets and all the different stuff that we do, and I just had to swim for an hour and a half just at the same speed, I probably wouldn't do it. I'd go and find something else.
Yeah, and it probably, cycling in a way is a little bit unique. Like if you're doing road cycling, you need to be out there in the elements. I think maybe for the variety, you can get a watt bike, or you can get a stationary bike inside, whack a TV show on, and watch your favorite. You just binge a series there for 2 hours, and you could do that. That's potentially a way to overcome some of that monotony. But you have to be out there. If you're competing in a road race, or you're actually competing in a long tri event or something like that, you actually have to be out in the road doing it and dealing with heat and wind and rises and climbs and all that kind of stuff. So interesting take. Glad there's some wriggle room there with how you can train for those long monotonous hours.
Yeah, some variations. I think is a good thing. I did ask Sebastian also about how much focused he is on zone 2, and then the other zone that a lot of people will talk about, and again, we'll tackle this a little bit more next week, but that's zone 4 and 5, kind of going between zone 2 and then almost skipping zone 3, and then just doing the high intensity stuff. How does he get his athletes to kind of interplay between those two zones? And his answer actually surprised me a bit. So let's play the clip.
In general, I don't like the classifications in zones. May it be 5 zones if we are using heart rate, may it be 7 zones if you are using power. I don't like this kind of distributions, because in the end you are like going very narrow. Maybe we are talking about 12 or 14 beats per minute between zones. So I think that physiology is not that narrow. So I normally prefer to, separate training intensity in the triphasic model. So we'll have like easy, medium, and hard, And if we use this kind of distribution, the kind of adaptations you get are quite more explicit to each one of the sections. So, I would say go easy. It doesn't matter whether it's, low zone 3 or upper zone 2, or maybe a while in zone 1, go easy, And most papers show us all the work that, for example, Stephen Seiler has done. All these papers show us that most elite athletes are training most of their time very, very easy. And then there are specific surges of high intensity, but in general, almost 80% of the work is done at very easy intensities. So just go easy. It doesn't matter that much whether you go 10 watts above or below a threshold.
So some interesting comments there, and I really appreciate the simplicity that he offers, kind of like
Love it.
with his clients there. It's going to lead me on to just to quickly discuss a couple of papers that relate to that 80% training volume for aerobic exercise. The first study is a study called What is the Best Practice for Training Intensity Distribution in Elite Athletes? And this was done by a big guy in the field called Celia. And this was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Sports, Medicine and Science in Sports in 2010. So that's a while ago. But basically, they did an analysis of athletes across cycling, running, rowing, and believe it or not, across all those different disciplines, most athletes actually training about 80% of their time in zone 2 anyway. So this is nothing new. Like this is what's been done for a long time. I think it's just got a lot of publicity lately. And in that paper, they also talk about high intensity is used sparingly, but with purpose. So you're either in zone 2 or you're going hard and not much in the middle. Then there's another paper that was published only last year. It was called Why Low Intensity Endurance Training for Athletes? ? Matamaki is the author. It's in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. And it's a great paper. This is free, by the way, if you want to have a read this one as well. It's really contemporary and new. The main thing I wanted to pick out of this, and this will interest you and me, Mick, being physios, is that he makes the point, or they make the point, that low intensity builds performance with minimal stress accumulation. And it supports long-term structural and behavioural consistency for elite athletes or athletes of any level. So that repetition is at a low level is safer than always going high. And also if we think about things like joint health, bone health, tendon health, that kind of thing, if you're going hard all the time, then that's not great for your body. But this low level, consistent zone 2, low level aerobic training basically just hardens your whole system. And I like that point in that paper.
Yeah, and it does put into perspective, like, you know, you look at a 9, like, because we're probably largely focusing here on runners, cyclists, rowing, you know, a bit more endurance-based athletes, but even, you know, team sports like soccer, AFL, rugby league, rugby union, there's within a 90-minute match or a 120-minute match of sport, when you sort of count all the stoppages and stuff, there's actually a lot of time, particularly with soccer, particularly with AFL, where a lot of the players are just cruising. Like they are, like, yes, it is a high intensity sport and there are brief bursts of effort, which Sebastian's already sort of flagged that already, is that high intensity needs to be done with purpose and with good quality, you know, appropriate training. But the big chunk of that field performance or court performance is actually going to be done at a really cruisy state, which is where this zone 2 stuff really sits nicely. So I think, you know, not all sports and not all athletes have to be flogging themselves to death, you know, day in, day out. There needs to be a couple of sessions per week that prepare you for those worst case scenarios in sport. But yeah, just remember a big chunk of it is, you know, like 80% in some athletes, yeah, where a big chunk of it's done in a really cruisy, easy state. So this is refreshing to, I guess, hear again and for our audience to take on board.
Yeah, just along those lines, I did speak to Sebastian about another reason that you do zone 2 is because even if you do have 6 or 8 hours a week to train, you're not going to be doing 6 or 8 hours of HIIT training or the Mick Hughes 4x4, are you? Like it will literally blow you up. And so he had some really cool comments about that, and we'll go to that now.
Well, it's quite individual, but in general, when you're talking about elite athletes, you will get almost always the same distribution of intensity. Basically, because, you know, if you are training 25 or 30 hours per week, it's impossible to do more than 10, 15, 12, 20% of that at high intensity. Because nobody is going to endure 1 week after another 5 hours of high intensity work, you know, per week. So basically, you can do one structure or the other, but if you look at the total picture after the entire year, you will see that for sure 80% of the time you have been below the first threshold.
So he makes a good point, and I'm sure that is something that we agree with as physios, is that, and we do see this also with people who, and I suppose it's an issue with modern life, not so much with the elite athletes, but, you know, for people like you and me who have only got a limited amount of time to train each week. Sometimes you think, well, I've only got 6 hours this week or 8 hours or whatever it might be. I'm just going to go hard that whole time. And you find that you're kind of going from completely sedentary behavior where you're on your computer and meetings all day, and then you're like stressing everything physically. And this zone 2 training, one of the things I took away from it is like, it's actually, from a human point of view, is probably how we should be living most of our lives, kind of in this low aerobic kind of state, walking around, gathering things, back in the hunter-gatherer days. Like, that's where we actually spend most of our time. Whereas now in modern life, I think we live at the poles. And it's an important thing that even if you do have 6 or 8 hours a week, it doesn't all have to be hard.
Totally agree.
Yeah. So that's it for episode 1. We didn't quite get a chance. I'm just really conscious of time. I did have a little bit of section in there on fat metabolism and metabolic flexibility, but we'll park that for another time. But hopefully that gives people just a little bit more understanding of exactly what zone 2 is, how to train it, where to train it, and why it's beneficial. So part 2, which we're going to go into next week, we're going to talk about its relationship and how you can balance it with high intensity interval kind of style training. And I look forward to that.
Awesome, mate. I can't wait to keep on digging deeper. That's been a great start. You've done a great job to synthesize everything to date, mate. And I can't wait to see how I can plug it into my Norwegian 4x4 protocol next week. So I'm waiting with bated breath.
All right, very good. Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Exercise Matters. If you enjoyed the chat, make sure to subscribe, leave a review and share it with your mates. A quick disclaimer, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical or individual advice. Always seek guidance from a qualified health professional for your specific needs. Big thanks to our sponsors, Premax, high performance skincare made for high performance people, and Learn.physio, world-class education for health professionals. Catch you next time.
See you next time.